Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue our reading of Tyler's Row by Miss Reed. Diana Hale has discovered a rumor that she is trying to oust her tenant, Sergeant Burnaby, to get the cottage for herself and her husband. She is appalled, but the postmaster tells her that no one who really knows her would ever believe such a thing. And with this crumb of comfort, Diana had to be content. Peter's comments were much the same. Let him tittle-tattle. We know we've nothing to reproach ourselves about. Damn it, the old boy might have snuffed it if you hadn't gone to the rescue. If he's pining to come back and can manage on his own again, then he must have the place, of course. He paused to sneeze 15 times in quick succession. Those blasted Pinks, he gasped. But let's hope, he continued, that fate protects us from him after all. Honesty was one of Peter Hale's strongest virtues. Chapter 18, End of Term. Fairacre School said goodbye to Mrs. Bonney with genuine regret. The last few days of term had been overshadowed by the problem of what to buy her for leaving present. All negotiations had to be conducted in secrecy, and many a sibilant whispering in my ear had driven me close to hysterics by tickling. Ernest had suggested a silver tea service. Someone had received such a gift after 50 years in the Caxley Borough offices, and no doubt the photograph in the Caxley Chronicle inspired Ernest's suggestion. When I pointed out the probable price, it was generally agreed that such richness was beyond our resources. Joseph Coggs nobly offered a pair of rabbits, as his doe had just had a litter of 8, and was willing to make a hutch to house them if he could get a wooden box from the stores. I was much touched by this generous offer, but felt that Mrs. Bonney might find it embarrassing. Joseph and I discussed the matter solemnly, and he agreed that transporting them would be exceedingly difficult, and the sea air might not agree with country-bred rabbits. Regretfully, the children turned down Joseph's suggestion, though there were plenty of offers to have any surplus rabbits for themselves if Joseph wanted homes. The girls' suggestions were rather uninspired, running to such things as scent, handkerchiefs, and boxes of chocolates. The boys were outspokenly scornful. Has them for Christmas. Scent, proper soppy. She don't eat chocolate, I know, 'cause she didn't want to bite off my Mars bar Thursday. We wants to give her some that'll last, said Patrick, like a tray. This inspired suggestion was greeted with respectful silence. It was Joseph Coggs who broke it. A tray'd be just right. We could get a little one for her by her bed, or a big one for carrying out the washing up. I thought Patrick's idea was quite the best we had heard, and promised to go shopping in Caxley on Saturday on their behalf. 280 us has got, Ernest impressed upon me. Should get a good un for that. I suppose if you saw a real smasher for £3, us might put up a bit more towards it. I said I would be happy to add a little extra. But Ernest, brought up in a strict evangelical home, would have none of it. No, that's not right. You got enough to do with your money. It's the school's present, this is. Has he, I wondered, ever seen me rifling in the OXO tin when hard pressed? In any case, I admired his honorable outlook and said I would do my best with the resources available. That settled, we were able to cope with end-of-term activities such as sports day, refreshment tent under the kind supervision of the Parent-Teacher Association, clearing out cupboards, dismantling the nature table, writing reports, checking stock, and so on. Mrs. Bonney was delighted on the last afternoon with her present of a sturdy carved oak tray, responded charmingly to the vicar's little speech, and invited us all to visit her whenever we were in her area. Fairacre School broke up in a clamor of well-wishing, and the children streamed down the lane shouting with exhilaration at the prospect of almost 7 weeks of freedom. Those mothers who had come to collect their offspring looked rather less joyous, I noticed. One morning in the early part of the holidays, I was wandering happily round the garden, enjoying the morning sunshine. There's something wonderful about being free and outdoors at 10 o'clock in the morning, when normally one is facing decimals or life in Anglo-Saxon England. I was admiring my sweet Williams and trying to persuade myself that they would do another year without splitting them when a car drew up and out leapt Gerard Barker. I was admiring my sweet Williams and trying to persuade myself that they would do for another year without splitting them when a car drew up and out leapt Gerard Baker. The passenger's door opened, and to my surprise, Vanessa emerged. She was actually smiling. "Hello," shouted Gerard. "I'm Aloysius hunting." "Well, he's not here," I told him, "but how lovely to see you both. Come in and sit in the sun." "I came along for the ride," said Vanessa by way of explanation. "Gerard brought Aunt Amy a book this morning and offered me a lift. I feel rather a fraud. I'm sure I should never be able to do research on anything at all." She looked with open admiration at Gerard. This was the longest speech I had ever heard Vanessa utter. Gerard Baker certainly seemed to work miracles. "Rubbish," said Gerard. "You've a very good brain. I'm going to ask you to make notes on this morning's discoveries. I'm sure you'll do it beautifully." He spoke briskly, like a kindly schoolmaster to a dim but striving pupil. I had to admit that the treatment seemed to be working. "We're really calling for directions. Can you tell us where Tyler's Row is? And do you think the people there will let us look at the cottage?" I told him about Sergeant Burnaby's illness and about the Hales, who would be next door. "But you simply must visit Mr. Willett in the village before you go," I said. "He's the real authority on Lycius. He had to sit through hours of his poems reading, a real case of, did you once see Shelley plain?" "Does Shelley come into it?" asked Vanessa. "A quotation," explained Gerard. "Shelley lived some time before Aloysius." "And wrote rather better poetry," I added. "Have some coffee." "Now that's real poetry," said Gerard. "I didn't have breakfast this morning." "Why ever not?" demanded Vanessa, looking protective. "It's very wrong to miss breakfast. It sets you up for the day and burns up all sorts of toxic whatnots." "You," I said accusingly, "have been listening to Aunt Amy. I bet she's on another dieting bout." "She is." They followed me into the kitchen, Gerard giving little grunts of appreciation as he came. "This Victorian Gothic period is really due for a comeback. The windows of your school are perfect, and I love that pointed doorway." "Drafty," I told him. "And this house, a perfect period piece. What lovely wide window sills." "I had those put in 10 years ago." Gerard was unabashed and peered round the kitchen door interestedly. "Oh, but you've modernized this. What a pity." "The Beatrice stove wore out," I said, "and the kitchen range needed to be burnished daily with emery paper and black lead as well. Life wasn't long enough. Filling oil lamps and trimming wicks took more time than I could spare, too." "Yes, I suppose so. No doubt electricity does make things simpler." But he sounded disappointed nonetheless. Over coffee, Vanessa told us that she was hoping to get a post at a hotel in Scotland in the early autumn. "More fun than an office, and I can use my typing and bookkeeping as well as meeting lots of people and helping to look after them. Meanwhile, Aunt Amy says I can stay at Bent as long as I like, or I can go home. I feel terribly lazy, but in better health since I've been here." "And in spirits," was my unspoken comment. Clearly, the middle-aged philanderer was fast being forgotten. "You just want to find as many interests as possible," advised Gerard, "until you get snapped up in matrimony in about 6 months' time." Vanessa turned great soulful eyes on him. "I shall never marry," she told him earnestly. "Never." "Don't you believe it," was the robust reply. "If you aren't the adored wife of some nice young man with a baby in a pram on the lawn within 2 years, I'll eat my new Irish tweed deerstalker." Vanessa shook her dark head sadly. "Come on, my dear," said Gerard, jumping up. "Work to do. The notebook's waiting for you in the car, and we must be off to Tyler's Row and Mr. Willett." "Good luck with Aloysius," I called after them as they proceeded with a series of alarming reports from the exhaust toward the village. A day or two later, I met Mr. Willett as I went to buy my groceries. "Very nice couple you sent me," he said, leaning over his gate. "They thinking of getting wed?" "I shouldn't think so." "Ah, well, might be a case of May and December, though he's a clever man, there's no denying." "I'm sure you were able to tell him quite a lot about Aloysius." "A tidy bit. He wanted to know what he looked like. Proper mess, I told him. Gravy stains all down his front, none too fragrant behind the ears. He never had a bath, you know, Miss Reed, not for months and months toward the end." "He might have done if he'd had a bathroom." "A bathroom," echoed Mr. Willett with scorn. "None of us had no bathrooms, but we all kept clean. We heaved the old tub in afore the kitchen fire of a Saturday night and got out the scrubbing brush and a chunk of yellow soap chopped off the bar with the coal shovel, and we fair went to town. But not old Aloysius, not him." "Did Mr. Baker see his cottage, do you know?" "Yes, Mrs. Hale took him in herself. That gal of his took a shine to it. Said she'd like to live there herself." "I wonder." "Tell you what, though," said Mr. Willett, lowering his voice, "that Mr. Baker don't know a thing about gardening. I was taking him round the vegetables, and he never knew peas from carrots. What's more, when I was talking about my Clevedon wonder, he kept looking across at my border and saying, 'Which flowers are they?' It shook me, I can tell you. Been in school and college too, I hear, and don't recognize Clevedon wonder? Makes you think about raising the school leaving age, don't it? I mean, if a boy don't know about Clevedon wonder by 15, what's he going to do?" I thought the subject should be changed swiftly, as I was not too sure about Clevedon wonder myself, and asked him to come and have a look at the school skylight sometime before term started. "I'll do that," he assured me, "though you knows as well as I do that damn skylight's let water in for nigh on 100 years and ain't likely to stop now, unless we takes the bull by the horns one day and boards it over. That'll settle it." His eye brightened at the thought of vanquishing his old enemy, and I left him to his dreams. Diana Hale was weeding the herbaceous border which ran down the garden against the hedge which divvied Mrs. Fowler's garden from her own. On the whole, it had recovered very well from the onslaught of Mr. Roberts' cows, and certainly the front of the border flourished. But Diana was puzzled about the plants at the back. The tall delphiniums and lupins, the red-hot pokers, and lofty Michaelmas daisies were looking decidedly peaky, and the leaves were turning brown. No doubt, Diana told herself, the old hawthorn hedge which had been there for so many years was the culprit, taking nourishment from the soil to the detriment of the newcomers. Nevertheless, it was perplexing. As she pondered on the problem, Tom strolled through from Mrs. Fowler's garden. Mrs. Fowler appeared too, looking grim. Diana thought it might be a propitious time for extending the olive branch, and greeted her cheerfully. "Lovely morning, Mrs. Fowler. Are you well?" "Mustn't grumble, I suppose," she said, doing just that from her tone. "I do apologize for Tom. I hope he's not a nuisance to you. It's so difficult to keep a cat on his own premises." "Those office dogs has to," commented Mrs. Fowler tartly, "or they gets criticized." She whisked indoors, and Diana resumed her weeding, very conscious that her olive branch had been thrown in her face. Some days later, Tom was sick. "What's he had for breakfast?" asked Peter, holding the shovel and a look of intense distaste on his face. "Some new stuff Pussy loves." "Well, ours obviously doesn't. I should throw the tin away. We don't get this trouble very often, thank God. The old boy's got a digestion like an ostrich's." A few days after this, Tom was sick again, and Diana was perturbed. "Shall we get to the vet?" "No, don't bother him. He's obviously all right as soon as the stuff's out of the poor old chap. Has he had that rubbish again?" "Pussy loves? No, just a morsel of liver this morning. He likes that normally." Tom's spirits certainly recovered quickly after the mishap, and nothing more occurred in the day or two before the Hales were due to set off on their brief holiday. Kitty, their former neighbor in Caxley, was having Tom for the duration. He and Charlie would renew their friendship and their suburban hunting together. Diana told Kitty about the mysterious attacks, but Kitty was reassuring. "I'll watch his diet, don't worry. He probably picked up some mouse or shrew that had been sprayed with insecticide, something of that nature. You two go off and enjoy your break. Tom will be happy enough here." Diana was unusually silent as they drove back to Tyler's Row. Kitty's remark about picking up something poisonous had started an alarming train of thought. Those flowers against the dividing hedge, the implacable malice with which her greetings were returned, could they really be clues to something sinister which was going on? Could anyone, even someone as spiteful as Mrs. Fowler obviously was, set out to hurt an unsuspecting animal simply because it trespassed? Diana told herself the whole idea was far-fetched and said nothing about her fears to Peter. Tomorrow they would be off on their travels, and heaven alone knew they both needed a rest. She welcomed the thought of leaving Tyler's Row and its troubles for a few days. What a relief it would be. Nevertheless, the doubts remained at the back of her mind, and she wondered what the future might hold on their return. Chapter 19. The Last Battle. The Hales returned, much refreshed from their few days' break. They headed north, explored the Yorkshire Dales, and visited some of the fine towns for the first time. Richmond in particular delighted them, and they promised themselves a return trip one day. It was a golden August evening when they drove down the slope of the hills which sheltered Fairacre. Already some of the fields had been harvested, neat bales of straw standing among the bright stubble, waiting to be collected. Dahlias were out in the cottage gardens, and some tall chrysanthemums, their heads shrouded in paper bags, reminded passers-by of the Caxley chrysanthemum show to come before long. "It looks autumnal already," sighed Diana. "I wonder how our garden's looking." "Grass up to our hocks, I expect," replied Peter. "It always grows twice as fast if you go away." They turned into the garage and surveyed Tyler's Row with satisfaction. The thatch glowed warmly in the rays of the sinking sun. Sergeant Burnaby's yellow rose was in full flower for the second time, and the scent of mignonette and jasmine filled the garden. "We've seen some heavenly places," said Diana, walking up the path, "but this beats the lot." "Every prospect pleases," quoted Peter, "and only the neighbors are vile." "Which reminds me," said Diana, "I must find out about Sergeant Burnaby's plans." They spent the next hour or so unpacking, eating poached eggs on toast, and ringing Kitty to let her know they were back. "By the way," Kitty said, "Tom's in great heart. No sickness, enormous appetite, polite to Charlie. In fact, the perfect guest. Leave him here any time you want to." They arranged to fetch him next day, and Diana took a final walk round the garden before it grew too dark to see. The plants at the back of the border looked as unhealthy as ever. What could cause their malaise? Could Mrs. Fowler really be attacking them? Surely no one would be so childish, thought Diana. She looked toward her neighbor's cottage and was amazed to see that two large white shells, which had once stood on each side of Sergeant Burnaby's doorstep, now flanked Mrs. Fowler's. Above them, swinging from the thatch, was a hanging basket which the old soldier had kept filled with scraps for the birds. Nonplussed, Diana went to the other hedge to check that Sergeant Burnaby's possessions had been moved. As she suspected, the shells in the basket were gone, and even more alarming, a number of holes in the garden gave evidence of plants having been dug up. No doubt those too had found a home on Mrs. Fowler's side of the hedge. Diana told Peter about these matters as they prepared for bed. "I had my suspicions about our boarder before we went away. This seems to prove that she is quite unscrupulous." "We'll go and have a look around in daylight tomorrow," said Peter, "and that old besom is being faced with this. It's the last straw." "She'll think we want to turn her out so we can get on with the conversion," said Diana, remembering the conversation she'd overheard in the post office. "She knows perfectly well we can't give her notice to quit, but she's a constant menace. We've stood enough. This pilfering and damage is going too far." After breakfast the next morning, Diana and Peter took the key and inspected the premises next door. Mrs. Willett had done a thorough job of cleaning and tidying. Sergeant Burnaby would have approved. The precious odds and ends of brass shone like gold, the leaded panes gleamed, and only the faintest hint of dust lay across the polished surfaces of the old man's furniture. Diana stood still and looked about her. As far as she could see, nothing in here had been taken. Mrs. Fowler had not been able to gain an entry, obviously. The first things to have gone would have been the brass ornaments, Diana felt sure. Human magpie that she was, Mrs. Fowler would have been unable to resist them. They went upstairs, and all looked exactly as Diana remembered it. The old man's counterpane was neatly spread. A pair of shoes stood side by side on the thin mat beside the bed. There was water in the flowered ewer standing in its matching basin on the old-fashioned washstand. It all looked so expectant, thought Diana, awaiting the master of the house. Would he ever come back to bring these things to life again? The whole house was forlorn in its silence, and she longed for voices, music, a fire, a kettle singing, even a fly buzzing against the window, anything to chase away the pathetic stillness of the waiting rooms. "Nothing seems to be missing," she said at last. They returned to the garden, locking the door behind them. The old man's weather-beaten wooden armchair still stood beneath the thatch by the back door, but something had gone. Diana wrinkled her brow with concentration. "That rustic table," said Peter, "used to stand here for his pipe and baccy and his glass of beer." Diana nodded. "And the antlers," she added. These had been fastened to the wall. Bleached bone white by years of Fairacre weather, they had given no pleasure to Diana's eye, but had obviously been treasured by the old soldier. The shield-shaped mount had left a clear mark on the brickwork. By daylight they could see even more. Telltale holes where plants had been removed were numerous. It was difficult to remember the garden in detail, but they had seen enough to know that a marauder had been at work. Now all that was needed was to trace the stolen goods to Mrs. Fowler. "We'll go round straight away," said Peter, making for the gate. "Wouldn't it be better if I called first?" said Diana, dreading a scene. "Straight away," repeated Peter, in a voice which brooked no argument. Fearfully, Diana followed him as he strode towards Mrs. Fowler's. And we will witness the great confrontation next time.